Welcome to the Creator Studio weekly webinar. Today we're going to be talking about Workday training due notifications. A little bit of a clarification here. We don't actually have Workday Learning at Moveworks, so this is something that I had to re-implement through a third-party tool. We'll talk about that in more detail during the demo. But as far as the interaction with Creator Studio works, the way that I've configured it for our demo today is still exactly how you would configure it if you do actually have access to Workday Learning and do have training courses too. And then we'll have a Q&A session at the end. So for something like this, where we have some requirement for our users, and that requirement is based on a deadline, and that deadline exists in some system that we have in our enterprise, so in this case, Workday, we need to be able to interpret that there is some upcoming event, and we need to notify users that they are about to exceed the bounds of that upcoming event. So in this case, not completing their training on time. So to do that, we'll need either a scheduled job or a job that runs on a trigger. When we say job in this case, we just mean some process running in your backend system that's evaluating that there's upcoming trainings that are about to be past due. So on the Workday side, if you have Workday Cloud Connect or Workday Studio in conjunction with Workday Learning, what you can do is you can pull information about students and courses assigned to students, and then the end dates or due dates of those courses, and then run an evaluation on for our trigger event. So if we're triggering it every Monday, which we are in the example that we're going to be walking through today, what courses are going to be exceeding their due date by the end of the given week. So for this given week, Friday is August 16th. So ensuring that I'm sending everyone notifications that they have an upcoming training that's due by the end of this week. And if they don't complete it, then it's going to be escalated to their manager. On the Creator Studio side, the portion that we're going to be processing is an outbound call from the source system. So in this case, Workday, that says we have our trigger event. This event has been initialized. So I have some students that have an upcoming course that they have not completed that is going to be due this week, and I need to send them a notification based on that. So in the message itself, we want to include the name of the training. So in this case, email security training, the source system, Workday Learning, and that training due date. So popping into our demo. So again, since I don't have access to a Workday learning environment, I've recreated a very similar flow in Workato. Let's start on the actual Creator Studio side though. So since this is a proactive message that we're going to be sending out from a source system, this is going to be housed in our events workspace. Within events, we have two main sections. So we have our credentials. This is just an API key that we generate. When you generate an API key, it will be hidden after the initialization. So you're going to want to save that API key. You're going to want to give it some credential name. We recommend creating an API key in an event on a per use case basis, or at least on a per system basis. So if you have a lot of different events type use cases that you're going to be doing in Workday, I'd recommend creating a Moveworks Workday API key or some equivalent of that. And then you could also generate it as an OAuth 2.0 client ID, depending on what authentication types your initialization system will accept here. So in this case, we're going to do an API key. I already have one published, and I don't want to display one publicly on this call, so I'm not going to do that here. But if we click the publish button, we'll have an API key generated for us that we can copy to our clipboard, and then we could use to make that API call. We also need to configure an event. So we can click create here, and all event API use cases must be associated with an actual event. So what this allows you to do is basically say, for the given API key, I'm going to associate it with this event, and that event can have a follow-up action or not, and you can select whether or not to show the greeting message. In this case, we'll click through it just for completeness. So the event name here will be Workday training due date notifications. You have the ability to add a follow-up action. So one thing that is not GA for all of our customers, but is available in some instances, is what we call event trigger paths or event triggered queries, which is you have some event, so something initialized from another system that you're processing through Moveworks. And then based off of that event, you may want to trigger a path or a query where you allow the user to look up information or initiate a multi-turn conversation that may lead to trigger another API call in a different system or just serving them some information that's relevant to them. So this is the event triggered path portion. So when we selected that we would want to do a follow-up action here, we're given the slots. So the slots are what we expect to receive from the API call. So looking at this is our message tester, which is available on our developer site. We can send some context, so some property object key. So this could be something like training name, email phishing training. And then we can process those variables in the Moveworks side here by saying the slot name as the key that we have constructed in our API call, i.e. training name. In this particular case, I don't actually need any slots. All I want to do is present an answer, and then that answer is just going to be a link out to Workday. So what we could do here is we could take in their Workday ID or take in the training URL from the Workday API and then respond with that. We could also just include it in our initial message that we send out to them. I'm going to pick my launch option here. Since this is a proactive notification, it's a lot safer to launch to all users because I have a very high level of control about who I'm going to be launching it to in terms of sending out that API call, but I'm still only going to allow it for myself here. Checking it's ready to be launched in production only really impacts the metrics. So for our Copilot or bot performance insights, that would be reflected in the metrics if that box is checked. If it's not checked, it won't be reflected in any of those bot metrics, so you won't see it coming up there. So now that we have our event, we have some event ID that's generated. So I'm going to copy this event ID. And then this is going to be our simulation for, we have some logic in Workday Studio that is processing the users who have an upcoming training that's due. So we're going to have some called from Workday that is analyzing that there's an upcoming training. And then at the end of that, we're going to want to make an API call to Moveworks where we have some configured message talking about the training and talking about the due date of the training. So what that looks like is always going to be basically the content of this message tester here. So you're going to have your API key, which you generate through the events module, and then you'll have your event ID, where you have defined any potential follow-up actions and the greeting, whether or not the greeting card should be displayed. So In this example, I have pulled dynamic results from the response object, which is something that you would also be able to do in Workday Studio, where based on the users who evaluate for your rule of having an upcoming due training, you want to pull those users by their email address, and then you're going to process those users into your API call and pull content dynamically for each one of them. So for John, I have email phishing training that he needs to complete. For Dre, I have executive leadership training that he needs to complete, etc. So we have our defined recipients, we have our event ID. So I'm going to save this and I'm going to test it. And then what we see here in Slack is the messages we've configured it. So this is going to be the content that we had configured in the API call. So we have that dynamic content, right? So those data pills or those variables that we have from our source system are processed at the system level and then are resolved prior to being sent out. So specifically, the training that I have due would be email security training. The due date is going to be this Friday, the 16th, and just asking that I set aside time to complete that training. I've also included a link here. Ideally, this would just be a link directly to their training module in Workday, which we should be able to pull from the same URL endpoints that contain the information about the due date and the course itself. On the API side, prior to actually implementing anything, I always recommend going to the developer site and using the API tester. This just confirms that the event ID that you have is operating as you would expect. So those follow-up actions or that follow-up path, if you have configured it, making sure that it's prompting in the way that you expect, that the link format is correct, and that the conversation that you're having with the user after the initialization point is how you expect it to be. And also just sanity checking that your API key is working, that you understand the format of the target server and the URL. Because this will automatically construct the URL for you based on the event ID that you provide. So always sanity check that your API key is working as expected. If you've generated an API key and you've generated an event, just as we've done in this demo, and for whatever reason you're getting an error, maybe a 401 error or 403 error, reach out to your customer success manager and let them know, hey, I generated an event, an API key in Creator Studio, but when I try to leverage that event and that API key, I'm consistently getting an error, and they'll escalate it to the customer success engineering team and will help you get it resolved. If you do run into that problem, I would just sanity check, create another API key, see if you have the same issue, and ensure that it's actually a consistent problem. Almost always it's just a formatting thing. So that's why I recommend using the message tester. It'll make sure that the formatting is correct for you. On the context side, we don't need to include a context. So if you don't have any variables, which we don't in this case, all that I've done in our example is I've removed this entire object up to the comma. So the only thing that we have defined is our message and our recipients list. The recipients list itself can be up to 500 users. So this could be a list of 500 users. If we have more than 500 users, we'll have to actually batch those calls out. And then tools that you use to make the API call should have some batching process in them. So in this case, Workato has a batching process. So I can batch this. It defaults to 100, but I can batch it up to 500. And in Workday Studio, you could also create batch jobs there as well. Oh, that'll be it for the demo today. In terms of how to learn more, I highly recommend checking out our Creator Studio developer certification. So this is on our developer and our Academy sites. Here we have guided training modules that cover all the key concepts of Creator Studio, as well as step-by-step videos similar to this covering key concepts and use cases. After completing the course, you'll be given a multiple choice exam where you can get a certification that you can display on your LinkedIn profile, which is always good to have. Also recommend checking out our documentation and developer community. So on the documentation side, I recommend checking out the developer site. That is where you can find our API message tester and then also our use case design patterns and additional information about how to configure slots, which you may need in use cases that are similar to this, but not quite this one. I also recommend checking out community. In our community site, we have a product forum specifically for Creator Studio, where developers can pose questions, ask how other organizations are utilizing Creator Studio that has been very beneficial for them, and have direct interaction with the product owners. We also have information on the upcoming roadmap there, and generally roadmap information is available on a per product basis in community. So if you have a specific product that you're very indexed on, like Moveworks Setup or Creator Studio, you can find the product roadmap for each of them in the relevant product forum and make sure that you're up to date on that information. So I do want to open it up for Q&A. So I do see, how can you trigger this event weekly? So unfortunately, because I don't have access to Workday Studio, I can't speak to exactly how you do it within Workday Studio. But pretty much every automation tool has some concept of a scheduled job. So you see this in ServiceNow, Jira, any ITSM system, any iPaaS system, pretty much any HRIS system. They should have the option for you to run a scheduled job, a scheduled process. They might call it an automated process. And you can trigger that job on just some scheduled basis where you say, I want this job to run once a week, once a month, once a day, etc. For something like this, where it is a upcoming training that has a static end date that we're going to be aware of far ahead of time. So whenever we assign that training, we'll be aware of what the due date of that training is. I'd recommend doing it weekly and just letting people know you have a training due this week. We don't typically recommend sending out multiple messages for something like this because users are very sensitive to being spammed, right? So we don't want to send them this message every day, letting them know that they have an upcoming training due that they must complete. We've sent them information. We've told them that they have the upcoming training. It's going to be escalated if they don't complete it, and it's on them to do their due diligence and actually finalize that training. So apologize, I can't show you that directly in Workday Studio, but it's going to follow this basic logic. Any other questions about events, event trigger paths, the API? Okay. Well, if there's no further questions, we're going to wrap this up a little early today. Please have a great rest of your day and tune in next week for more Workday use cases. Thank you.